Hello, this is the second lecture on the Indus Valley script, the second of 10 Envision lectures. And this will be relatively brief. Again, I'm Dr. Steve Bonta. And if you are already very familiar with this, with kind of the background information regarding decipherment, the first lecture was on decipherment, generally the history of decipherment and this kind of thing, and also the Indus Valley script and what that is. This one, we're going to talk briefly about the language situation in South Asia. And, and so if you're already familiar with that, you can profitably skip this lecture and move directly to the third lecture, lecture 3, which is the first lecture where I will begin the process of explaining the decipherment of the partial decipherment of the script and how I arrived at the sign values that I've arrived at and what all of that means and so forth and so on. But anyway, without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the languages of South Asia. Now, South Asia is a large, immensely complex piece of terrain. I've spent quite a bit of my life there, and in Sri Lanka, in India, and in Pakistan. More recently, I've spent some time there. I've not been to Nepal or Bangladesh. This map also shows Afghanistan as part of South Asia. That's perhaps debatable, but in point of fact, where the Indus Valley civilization is concerned, there are Indus sites in Afghanistan, outposts. So even though Afghanistan is kind of the other side of the Hindu Kush range, outside of the Indian subcontinent per se, it is sometimes also included in South Asia. And then finally, the nation of Bhutan, up in the Himalayas, is nominally part of South Asia. It's primarily Tibetan and so forth. And this map is a map of the South Asian language families writ large. So you'll notice the kind of grass green, light green are the so-called Indo-Aryan languages, which Hindi and Urdu and Bengali are the most widely spoken, but they also include Gujarati, Nepali, Bihari is considered to be a language by some. Marathi is a major language spoken in Madhya Pradesh, or in Maharashtra, excuse me, where Bombay or Mumbai is also located. And there are other lesser-known languages like Konkani. I mentioned Nepali already. And many others. Oriya or Odia, the language of Odisha state, is and Assamese in the far northeast are all part of the Indo-Aryan language family. And you notice also that on the island of Sri Lanka, much of that is green. That corresponds to the language Sinhala, which is one of the languages that I learned in the course of my PhD research. It is an Indo-Aryan language, although because of its location in southern India, it has been heavily influenced by the other major language group of the area, the Dravidian languages, which are on this map represented kind of in the dark blue. The Dravidian languages are also, it's an important language group. If you've met members of the Indian diaspora in Europe, the United States, Canada, and so forth, you've probably met people who speak Tamil or Telugu, perhaps Malayalam or Kannada. Those are the four major Dravidian languages. There are a number of minor languages ranging from small tribal languages in the south like Tota and Koda, spoken in the Nilgiri Hills, a bunch of them kind of scattered around central India, and one even in Pakistan. You'll notice over in Pakistan, let's see if it shows the cursor up here, this patch of blue corresponds to a language called Brahwi, which is actually a language of an itinerant people, what we used to call gypsies, I guess, found mostly in the Baluchistan region of Pakistan. You can see some Brahwi encampments at the very west side of the Sindh, north of Karachi also. Along the highway, there's some Brahwi people there. But anyway, there are several 100,000 Brahwi speakers, and so that's actually a not inconsequential Dravidian language. So when we think of South Asia, we think primarily of the Indo-Aryan and the Dravidian language groups. The darker green up here is labeled Iranian languages. Now, these are, of course, in that part of the world, correspond primarily to Baluchi in Pakistan, and then over in the Afghan side, Pashtun, and so forth. And, of course, they're related also to Farsi, the language of Iran, and also Kurdish, and some other languages in that area. And taken together, the Iranian languages and the Indo-Aryan languages constitute the Indo-Iranian superfamily, as it were, which is part of a larger group of languages called the Indo-European languages, of which more in a few minutes. Okay, the Dravidian languages, by contrast, the blue, are also one of the world's larger language groups. Telugu is the largest, the most spoken Dravidian language, and it has just shy of 100 million speakers, maybe 90 million, 85 million, something like that. And Tamil's not far behind it. So these are large numbers, and they're actually spoken. If you go to Malaysia or in Singapore, you'll also see large numbers of Indians there, and almost all of them speak Tamil. And also in Sri Lanka, there's a large Tamil population, which in the fairly recent past was a source of ethnic conflict, a 30-year civil war between the Sinhalese people and the Tamils on that island. Okay, but the other language groups, so the Dravidian languages are not related to the Indo-Aryan or the Indo-Iranian or Indo-European language group at all. They are separate. There are have been some linguists, particularly the proponents of the so-called nostratic theory, that like to contend that if you go far enough back, there's evidence that the Indo-European group and the Dravidian group and other language groups as well, the Semitic language and so forth, were at one point, were all related. And that may have been the case, but we're talking perhaps tens of thousands of years in the past. And so it's very difficult to really establish with any certainty any kind of pedigree of that sort, just because languages change over time and so much time has presumably elapsed since the breakup of any hypothetical nostratic language group. So for our purposes, the Dravidian languages on the one hand and the Indo-Aryan on the other are separate stocks. Also in the map, these purple blocks here correspond to, it says Austroasiatic languages. Well, these are what are called the Munda group, and they're related to certain languages found in Southeast Asia, like the Hmong language, the Khmer language, and so forth. So that's a widespread language group, and the Munda languages in India, of which Santali is the most widely spoken. I believe it has like 9 million speakers, and there's others like Sora, which is a very interesting tribal language, and so forth. The Munda languages probably came from Southeast Asia originally, or the result of a dispersal upwards from Southeast Asia. And then you have this rather large, broad orange belt of Tibeto-Burman languages. And these correspond primarily to languages similar to Tibetan itself, which are spoken all the way across here, from Bhutan, actually from Arunachal Pradesh in northeast India, which of course China also claims. There's a major border dispute there. Bhutan, the Mustang region of Nepal, in particular the interior, the trans-Himalayan part of Nepal, and on over into up here. This is Ladakh and other areas, and then in Pakistan as well, the area there that speaks the Tibetan type language, but they've converted to Islam and to Muslims in Pakistan. And then over here, more Burma-like languages like Manipuri and so forth from the state of Manipur on the border with Burma, and I believe this is Mizo and Mizoram and so forth. In northeast India. So these are ultimately the Tibeto-Burman languages related to Tibetan, Burmese, and Chinese, are like the three that would most likely be familiar. Most people have not heard of Ladakhi, for example, which is a type of Tibetan language spoken in the Indian state of Ladakh up here in this area, and uses the Tibetan writing system, which interestingly is derived ultimately from the writing systems of India, and in particular seems to be most closely allied to the writing system used for writing Bengali and Assamese in northeastern India. And then finally, just by way of note, so the Nuristani languages here correspond to what we would call Kashmiri, Kashmir and so forth. They are a little bit hard to figure out. And the unclassified language isolate here referred to as Burushaski, which is the language spoken by the Hunza people, the Hunza Kut in the Hunza Valley in northern Pakistan. If you travel the Karakoram Highway, you'll drive through Hunza, and you'll hear Burushaski spoken. It is related to no known language. And then you can see there's some Turkic over here, a little bit encroaching into Afghanistan. Okay, so the point of all this is to ask the very important question, what might the language or languages underlying the Indus script be related to? So that's kind of what we're getting towards with this presentation. Next slide shows the Indo-European language family, just for a little perspective. I think I can move the picture over here for a moment. There we go. So you can see here, the purple in this map is the Indo-Aryan languages, including the little isolate, well, isolate, the outlier down in Sri Lanka, Sinhala, and then the closely related Iranian group, which stretches all the way across most of Iran, Afghanistan, and up into, these are the Kurds over here in Turkey and so forth. And these are in turn related to this larger family, the Indo-European language family, which, as you can see, includes English. Ultimately, English is a Germanic language. The Germanic subgroup of Indo-European on this map is indicated with red, so you can see that Icelandic and Iceland, Faroese and the Faroe Islands. Well, you can't actually see that. You can see Svalbard up here where they speak Norwegian. Of course, the Scandinavian languages, German itself here in Austria and Switzerland, and also Dutch and Flemish are all part of, along with English and Frisian as well, are all part of the Germanic language group. And they're all quite closely related to one another, but they're part of the Indo-European language family as well, which is the reason if you study a language like, say, French or Spanish, or even Russian over here, the Slavic languages, you will occasionally find words that look sort of like English words. And they say, well, why is that? So, for example, in English, the word for father, well, is father, okay? And it's similar to German Vater, right? Well, the Latin word, as anyone familiar with the Catholic liturgy is aware, is pater, okay? And that's not a coincidence. Father and pater are actually related. Not only that, if you look at the oldest Indo-Aryan language of record, Sanskrit, way over in India, the word for father is Pitar, okay? Pitr, technically. And in Russian, it's pat. And that's pretty much the same word throughout the Slavic language group. Okay, that's not a coincidence. It's one of many pieces of evidence linking all these languages together. And so, in the fairly primordial past, nobody knows exactly how long ago. The recent theory set forth just last year suggests that it may be more recent than some people have supposed, or may not be as recent as some people suppose. There was presumably a language which we call Proto-Indo-European that was the ancestral tongue of the languages of northern India and most of that part of the Middle East that doesn't speak Arabic or Turkish, as well as a large part of Europe, most of Europe in point of fact, and stretching well out into Central Asia, thanks to the dispersal of Russian eastward across Siberia. This is the Indo-European language family. And at some point, the ancestors of that language, who we call the Proto-Indo-Europeans, lived somewhere in Central Asia, or perhaps in another rival theory puts them in early Asia Minor, the Turkey, mainland Turkey. We're not actually sure whether they were in Anatolia or whether they were somewhere over here between the Black and Caspian Sea, or perhaps on the other side, east of the Caspian Sea. This map does not show, interestingly, the two Tocharian languages, Tocharian A and B, both dead languages, which are discovered clear over here in what is now Xinjiang, formerly East Turkestan in China. And they are attested in a whole bunch of scrolls that were discovered in various ruined monasteries, wayposts along the Silk Road, and this kind of thing. And they're estimated to be like 1,500 years old. And they were spoken. They were Indo-European as well. The Tocharian languages were. And the odd thing is that they have certain features in common with the more the westernmost Indo-European languages, the Celtic languages, the Germanic languages, and so forth. So this map is actually not complete. It only shows living Indo-European language speaker families and so forth. Anyway, the Indo-European language family is immense and very complex. It is by far the largest language family In the world, Tibeto-Burman is second place in terms of numbers of living speakers, but Indo-European is immensely complicated, complex. And let's just drill down a little bit more in the Dravidian language family, shown here. Here you can see in the map Tamil, which is the language of Tamil Nadu here, and also northern and eastern Sri Lanka. And then here in the hills around Nuwara Eliya in particular, in the highest parts of the hills of Sri Lanka, there is a large Tamil population who primarily work on the tea plantations. And they're actually descended from Indians who were brought in, from Tamil Nadu, from India itself, by the British back in the 1800s. And their descendants still live there. Then over here on the Malabar coast, which is the Indian state of Kerala, we have the language of Malayalam, which is a very it's quite similar to Tamil. It does have its own writing system. It's spoken even more rapidly than Tamil. It's a lot harder to understand. I mean, the Dravidian languages are complex and difficult to learn. I've studied 3 of the 4 major ones, Tamil in particular, in considerable depth, followed by Telugu. But Malayalam, Kerala is a very interesting place. It's mostly tropical rainforest and this kind of thing. And it has long been on the receiving end of trade across the Arabian Sea from the Middle East. And so it has long been kind of outward-looking area of India, and a very interesting place to visit. And then, of course, Telugu up here used to be just one state, Andhra Pradesh, but now there's Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. It's split into 2 different states that both speak Telugu up in the Deccan Plateau. And Hyderabad, which is one of India's most advanced cities and centers of tech innovation and so forth, is Telugu speaking. And then there are other less important languages. Again, here's Brahwi, primarily in Pakistan, in the Baluchistan area of Pakistan. Not been well studied, Brahwi has, because Baluchistan, even to this day, is quite dangerous for foreigners to visit. And so very few foreigners actually go there, much less go there to actually conduct any studies, ethnographic research and that kind of thing. All right, so that's the Dravidian language group. Now, if you look at the map for a second before we move on to the next slide, you'll notice something interesting. You'll notice that the Dravidian languages are primarily, but not exclusively, in the southern part of the Indian subcontinent, as well as in Sri Lanka. Now, the lore of the people of Sri Lanka holds that at a certain time in the past, there was a certain prince named Vijay who was a real rascal, and he and his friends went around because his father was the king. They were somewhere up in here in India, and his father finally was forced to exile them because they were conducting depredations, raping women and doing all kinds of things that they weren't supposed to be doing. And the people complained against the king and threatened to revolt against him if he didn't do something about his son. So Vijay and his other brothers in crime were put on a boat and told to sail away and not come back. And so supposedly they sailed down to the island of Lanka, where Vijay ingratiated himself with a local princess and married, and eventually became a very Machiavellian figure is Vijay. But anyway, that's the idea, is that the Sinhala people arrived there and sort of took over. And so it's assumed that the Dravidians, the Tamils, were on Sri Lanka first and were kind of squeezed out by these very aggressive invaders to a certain extent. And so the area is occupied by the Sinhalese people, primarily this part of Sri Lanka, is the wetter, more fertile part of the island. This area up in the north, the so-called Vani, is relatively dry and not as amenable to agriculture. And the same can be said of the east coast areas, Trincomalee down south. I've spent a lot of time traveling around Sri Lanka, very familiar with it. So so the Sinhalese have kind of gotten the better part of that. But anyway, the evidence seems to suggest that in the past, the Dravidian speakers were more widespread than they are now. Okay, so you can see here, there are little patches outside of South India, and then over here in Pakistan. And so this has led some people to suggest, or to say that, well, maybe the Dravidians were the original inhabitants of South Asia, and the Indo-Aryans are encroachers, especially if it's true, and it probably is, that the Proto-Indo-European originated somewhere in Central Asia. then it stands to logic that at some point Indo-Aryan speakers moved into and occupied at least this area. The Indus Valley is up here, and then eventually spread further into India. We're pretty sure that the painted grayware culture, the first post-urban culture after the collapse of the Harappan culture, which I mentioned in the first lecture, that they were Indo-Aryan speakers. So it's somewhat natural to say, well, okay, then perhaps the people of the Indus Valley were the primordial inhabitants of the Indus Valley civilization, were the primordial inhabitants of South Asia, and perhaps they spoke Dravidian. Okay, and so now we can move to the next slide with this thought. I guess I'll keep the picture where it is. So this is Henry Harris, who actually was a priest, I believe, and he is the first person to have suggested the so-called Dravidian hypothesis. He suggested in the 1930s, quite some time ago, not long after the first excavation reports for Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were published. He said, well, these people were probably Dravidians, and because the ethno-linguistic evidence suggests that Dravidian speakers were once more widespread. So this became, and what he said was, in fact, what probably happened was that the Indo-Aryans were aggressive nomadic horsemen, along the lines of the Mongols and the Huns and people like that, who came down out of Central Asia, or the Scythians, who, by the way, were Indo-European, the Scythians, who bedeviled the people of the Middle East in the first millennium BC. Anyway, so the idea was, well, they were akin to them, but they invaded India instead of the Middle East or other places, and they displaced the inhabitants. And there are some verses in the Rig Veda that seem to suggest a racial divide in early India, and suggest that the Dasus, the dark-skinned people, were perhaps the Dravidians who were displaced and enslaved and so forth by the lighter-skinned Indo-Aryans. That at least was the notion, and this is known as the Indo-Aryan invasion hypothesis. The idea that the Dravidians, that the Indus Valley civilization was in fact Dravidian, and the language of the seals was an early form of Dravidian, is known as the Dravidian hypothesis. So anyway, so it comes down to this, and this is actually our last slide. The language of the Harappans, that's really what this project is about. When we talk about deciphering the seals, the writing on the seals, we have several possibilities. One is that it's Dravidian, and this has been the supposition of most, though not all, but nearly all scholars who are not from the Indian subcontinent, for a variety of reasons. So, for example, the Finnish team led by Asko Parpola is the Dravidian, or Dravidianists, if you will. The Russians, a little earlier on, Kamil Zvelibil, who was in fact a Dravidian linguist, that was his specialty, also assumed that the language of the seals was Dravidian. Walter Fairservice, a very, very noted archaeologist who died back in the 1990s, was also a proponent of the Dravidian hypothesis. And many others as well. If you look around, you'll see that people nowadays who populate the web, who are putting proposals for decipherment, you'll often see the word Dravidian in association with this language. Now, another possibility, and by far the less popular of the two main theories until recently, is the notion that actually they were probably Indo-Aryan speakers, and a lot of people who have supported this have done so perhaps for jingoistic or cultural reasons, because to assert that the language of the Indus civilization was in fact an early form of Sanskrit is as much as to validate all of the mythology that's associated nowadays in some people's minds with Hindu nationalism, Hindutva as it's called, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which just means the Indian People's Party. And so for this reason, some people have just reflexively poo-pooed the notion. There have been some people, a man named Michener wrote a very nice little book back in the 1970s, I think it was, in which he kind of tried to use the same methods of Alice Cobers and Michael Ventris to analyze and comparatively analyze some of the inscriptions and looked at and saw evidence for different inflections. This was something that I thought I found early on as well, but later realized that that wasn't what it was, and we'll talk about that much later. But anyway, but the point of but Michener also came to the conclusion that it looked to him more like an Indo-Aryan language, and there have been a couple of others that have gone down that road as well. But in general, the notion that the Harappans could have spoken Indo-Aryan language has been set aside, ignored, and in the view of most scholars, has been discredited for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Now, another possibility, of course, is that we're dealing with some kind of language X, as the phrase is. In other words, it's some language that no longer exists. And there is certainly archaeological precedent for that sort of thing. For example, the Etruscans, who were the dominant culture on the Italian peninsula before the rise of Rome. In fact, the Tarquins, the Tarquinian dynasty, whose oppressions eventually led to the creation of the Roman Republic, were Etruscans. And there are lots and lots of inscriptions of Etruscan, particularly tombs and things like that. There's a lot of inscriptional material. Some of the words can be read, but the Etruscan language has left no modern relatives. It was basically a language that completely died out. The same can be said, apparently, for the various Iberian languages, for which, again, there's fairly abundant inscriptional evidence all around the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal primarily. There were a number of these were languages that were spoken in Iberia before the Roman conquest imposed Latin on them, which became Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, and other minority, Galician and so forth, the patchwork of Romance languages spoken in Iberia today. People think Basque may be related to those Iberian languages, but it's never been proven. So again, we have all these inscriptions. They're basically written as Etruscan was, in modified alphabetic type writing of some sort that's readable, but it's really not readable because we don't know what the language is. The same may well be true of Linear A and Cypriot and other languages that are as yet undeciphered, because the reality is some languages do go extinct and leave no traces. This is, of course, the case with Sumerian. There are no modern relatives of the Sumerian language, and Elamite, also another major civilization in the Iranian plateau, antecedent to the Persians, more or less. And all of them well attested, but really not readable in any sense. So it's certainly a possibility that our language does not have any modern relatives. And then finally, we should note the possibility that more than one language is encoded in the Indus texts. And in fact, that's not a possibility, that's a certainty, because at least several of the seals that come from the Middle East are very clearly not, anyone familiar with the patterning of Indus signs look at them and say, okay, that's not the language of the Harappans, whatever else it may be. One of them uses a very common sign that looks like a jar. We'll have much to say about that sign in future lectures, and it's basically doubled. It's a geminate, and that never occurs anywhere else. And so, but there are only like 3 or 4 such inscriptions, and what they seem to encode is presumably names or something else from a non-Harappan language, from whatever they encountered in the Middle East. So there are examples of that. A more interesting question is whether or not the bulk of the corpus that actually does come from the Indus Valley may contain more than one language. And I would say that, the jury is open on that. It's possible, but from what I can tell from my investigations, the great majority of the seals seem to be one language in particular. And we'll have more to say about what that is in future lectures. But that should be enough for a background as far as the languages and the possibilities are concerned. Well, I should just say this. If it is Dravidian or Indo-Aryan, of course, we are at least dealing with something that's known and familiar. In the case of Dravidian, the Tamil language is the oldest attested Dravidian language. It goes all the way back to at least several centuries BC. So if the language of the Harappans is also Dravidian, it might still be recognizable, but it would be much more archaic. Obviously, it would be at least more than 1,000 years before the earliest recorded Dravidian writing. So that would be tricky. The Indo-Aryan languages, on the other hand, the Sanskrit, the oldest Sanskrit texts are of uncertain date. People who tell you they know exactly when the Rig Veda was composed are blowing smoke. No one knows exactly when the Vedic hymns were written, but certainly antecedent to 1000 BC, and so fairly proximate in time to the the late Harappan phase. But again, that one would suppose that it would be possible to recognize, to use what we know about the early Indo-Aryan languages that come down to us, in particular the text from the Rig Veda, the oldest of those materials, to help. All right, so that's a picture of the languages that we're dealing with. With the next lecture, lecture 3, it will probably be a lot longer and more detailed. We're going to begin the process of looking at the script itself, the Indus corpus, and seeing whether we can find any kind of entering wedge based on the evidence available on which to build a case for decipherment. Thank you very much.